The topic is slavery and freedom in the Spanish-Mexican borderlands, and it centers specifically on fugitive slaves. Fugitive slaves that flee first the English colonies and then the United States to find freedom first in Spanish Florida, then in Spanish Texas, and then in Mexico. And this is largely based actually in a class that I also taught here at the Atascocita Center. It's a class that I taught back in 2018. And it's a class that I taught for about 3 semesters in a row, and about the Underground Railroad to Florida and Mexico. So actually on this, it's a new topic, it's an emerging topic. The examples are not fleshed out, some of the information is still being recovered. But also, there's also quite a bit of information that I will try to share in the next, 30, 40 minutes or so, 35 minutes or so. And actually, well, first, let me talk about the sources. These 3 books are really, really excellent. The first one, South to Freedom. It came out in 2020. And we had a speaker that gave a talk here during the pandemic. So we have that recorded on Zoom on the YouTube channel. It's Alice Baumgartner. And more than anything, she concentrates on how Mexican abolitionism influenced the coming of the Civil War. Her argument is that actually Mexican abolitionism had a larger influence in the coming of the Civil War than British abolitionism. And she did some research in England. She was a Rhodes Scholar in England, and she's right now at University of Southern California. Then Thomas Marité, the book in the middle. This book just came out very recently. Before that, I had read 2 of his articles that are now book chapters. And he argues more than anything that we should not be calling this research subjects. We should not call them fugitives or runaways because that implies criminality. He argues that they ought to be called refugees because that's what they were. They were refugees that were escaping exploitation. And then finally, Seeds of Empire. This book came out, it's been almost 10 years. He digs very, very deep into the history of Texas, and he is one amongst many that makes this very strong argument that the main cause of the Texas Revolution was Mexican abolitionism. It was Mexican law that actually declared that that the presence of slaves in Texas was illegal, and that they had to be emancipated, and this is what compelled the Texans to, Anglo-Americans to declare independence. And all of them are very well researched. There's a lot more literature. I have a long bibliography on this if anybody's interested. But these are great starting points. And here, I want to start talking about the presence of Africans in colonial Mexico. The expeditions, the conquistadors, they had slaves among them. They had African Americans among them. And some of these were enslaved and others were free. In this case, this is actually a Native American painting. The person on horseback is Hernan Cortez, and right behind him is Juan Garrido, his squire, who was a free African. He was born in Spain. He was free, and he joined this expedition. There were others in that same expedition, and they included Francisco Eguía, Juan Valiente, Sebastián Toral. There were many Africans that accompanied the conquistadors, and this actually paved the way for Mexico to have the largest African population in the 16th century of the entire Western Hemisphere. In the 1500s, Mexico became the destination of enslaved people. It was the largest colony in the Spanish Empire. This is long before the English settled North America. And this is before the Portuguese developed Brazil into the largest slave colony in the history of the world. And that is Brazil. Brazil is by far the largest. And, many people ask today, if in Mexico, if we had the largest population, the largest American population, where are they today? And I would say, well, you're looking at them. They intermarried and they mixed. So, this morning, I had a student say, I just made a DNA test. And I always thought, I'm Mexican, so I'm supposed maybe half Spanish, half Native American. It turns out that I'm like 70% Native American and 10% African. And she's from one of these towns where fugitive slaves developed colonies. So she's probably a descendant of fugitive slaves that fled the U.S. and settled in Mexico, which is the story that we will tell later. In colonial Mexico, there were several avenues of freedom actually throughout the Spanish Empire. They included, the fact that the Catholics, Spanish Catholics, actually acknowledged the humanity, but not the equality of Africans. And so they offered several avenues for freedom, or they existed several avenues for freedom. One was military service. Joining the military, in many cases, people earned their freedom by joining the Spanish militias. And so we will see in a little bit how the Veracruz, Havana, and San Agustin were defended by all black militias. And many of these were slaves that earned their freedom that way. Also, another way was by intermarriage. And most African men, enslaved men, actually, they did this on purpose, finding Native American spouses, because that way their descendants would be free. If they themselves died in slavery, their descendants will not be enslaved. And there were other avenues, like being the victims of sexual exploitation in colonial times. Enslaved women, in many cases, they found advocates, and they sued their masters who had impregnated them. And they earned their freedom that way, by proving that they had been sexually exploited. And these were some avenues that existed in the Spanish colonial empire, in the Spanish Empire. Yes?
I'm sorry, Professor. So did the courts recognize that the women who were impregnated by their slave owners as being, I guess, did they give them rights in order to be able to sue?
Yes. Well, no, in many cases, they found an advocate. They did not themselves initiate the lawsuit, but there were advocates. These advocates frequently were actually Franciscans, were missionaries that opposed slavery, and that's how they initiated the lawsuits, by finding an advocate. Which means also that slavery is contested in the colonial period. Now, this does not mean that the Spanish are, necessarily, they treat their slaves better, because in Cuba, in the sugar colonies of Cuba, they worked their slaves to death within a period like 6 to 7 years. So they could be just as brutal, they could be as nasty as anyone, and especially when sugar that produced so much wealth in such a short period of time, they felt that it was, in a way, labor was expendable. Human lives were expendable. They die, we just get more, especially as the Atlantic slave trade grows in the 1600s and the 1700s. It's the height of the Atlantic slave trade. And so human beings become very, low cost. People can purchase human beings at a very low cost. And that is, because I don't want to give the impression that, the Spanish good, English bad. The Spanish could commit the most horrible crimes against humanity. But in this case, yes, there were these avenues for freedom, including suing their masters. And what this means is that slavery eventually becomes a dying institution by the end of the colonial period. But going back and talking a little about exploration, the Spanish were the first to explore what becomes the American South and the Southwest. They took Africans in many of these expeditions. Of course, they spread disease, which decimated the colonies, decimated the Native American population, and made it easier to conquer them. If 90%, if 50% of them are dead, they become a lot easier to exploit. In these expeditions, they also accompanied by both free and enslaved Africans. One very famous is Esteban. Esteban joined the Narvaez expedition. He was enslaved by Esteban Dorantes, so he takes the name of his master, Dorantes. And this expedition came out of Cuba. It's this one in Narvaez. It's this one in orange. And they attempted to settle Florida, and they failed. Well, they encountered storms that destroyed their ships. They were mauled by Native Americans who defeated them, and eventually a few survivors floated on rafts and landed in Galveston. Very few landed in Galveston. Of those, only 4 survived. The 4 that survived, Cabeza de Vaca, Castillo, Dorantes, and Dorantes' slave, that's also call him also Esteban Dorantes, it was the slave actually who kept them alive. Because Native Americans here in this area of Galveston, they did not feed him. And so they actually had him captives, and they demanded that they grow their own food. They actually dig for their own food, collect their own food. And then being Spanish gentlemen, they found that, humiliating and also impossible, because they simply could not do it. And it was actually Esteban that pretty much fed the 4 of them. He kept them alive, and he also engineered their escape, and so they wandered throughout the Southwest and eventually made it to Mexico City thanks to Esteban. The whole time Esteban was thinking that he was going to be set free once they got to Mexico City. No, instead they sold him to the Viceroy. They sold him to the Viceroy. Then he led another expedition to today's New Mexico, where he disappears from the historical record. Some people think that he faked his own death. Others think that he was actually murdered, well, killed by Native Americans. Killed by Native Americans. But he is a fascinating story. There's also a book about him, an excellent book that we have used in the past. So this shows that Africans have always been a part of Mexican history, U.S. history, exploration, that there's actually, the history of Africans is actually a lot deeper than we had previously thought. The Spanish settled, finally Florida becomes the first permanent European settlement in 1565 after many failed attempts. And now Florida is not what where a Spanish immigrant wants to move, a settler. They want to settle to areas where they can exploit large numbers of Native Americans for labor, places where they can dig for gold, but not to Florida to deal with alligators and mosquitoes and swamps. That's not exactly a paradise. However, Florida is essential. It's essential for the defense of the empire. The English are getting closer and closer. At one point in the 1600s, they settled the Carolinas. In the early 1700s, they settled Georgia. The English are getting closer. And the whole time, as far back as the 1500s, actually, you have English corsairs, you have pirates at the service of the British Empire and the French Empire that are constantly harassing the fleets, the Spanish fleets, which are carrying all this treasure. Not only the treasure that comes out of Mexico, which is the biggest silver deposit of the 15 and 1600s and 1700s, but actually all the wealth of the entire empire. The wealth from the Philippines, that much of that was trade from the Philippines. They traded with China, India, Japan, silk, porcelain, spices, perfumes, all landed in Acapulco on the Pacific and then was transported over land to Veracruz. So it made across, from the Pacific over to Veracruz. Then from Veracruz, it was put on fleets, and these fleets transported that to Spain. They use these currents, and the whole time they're being harassed by corsair, by privateers that want to take this wealth. And so they depend on these naval bases. The naval bases of Veracruz, Havana, and San Agustin. San Agustin is crucial. They depend on the currents, so they take the Gulf Stream, come out of Veracruz. They are escorted the whole time by the Spanish Navy. The Spanish Armada is escorting this. They have these military bases. Who are the soldiers? Who are the warriors in these military bases? They are Africans. And there's at least one book on the African troops of colonial Mexico. And there's one on the colonial troops of San Agustin that is not on this presentation. It's by Jane Landers. It's just called Black Society in Colonial Florida, in Spanish colonial Florida. It's a very simple title. So the Spanish then develop all black militias here in Veracruz, all black militias in Havana, all black militias in San Agustin that are crucial for the defense. The English are getting closer and closer, but nobody wants to move to Florida. So what do the Spanish do? Entice fugitive slaves from the Carolinas and from Georgia. And hundreds come, eventually thousands. One of them, very famous, and my 1301 students know about a lot about him, is Francisco Menendez. He's born in Senegambia around the 1690s. He travels, well, no, he doesn't travel. He's taken captive, sold in the Carolinas, escapes, joins the Yamasee tribe who fights against the English. They flee because they lose the war. They flee to Florida. The Yamasee sell him as a slave to the Spanish. And then, actually, it's Captain Francisco Menendez who buys him, so he also has the name of his master, the same name as his master. But he's such a brilliant military mind that they very soon put him in the militias, in the all-black militia there, and he rises to captain. And he is eventually granted full freedom, and he becomes the main defender of Spanish Florida. He defends Spanish Florida in the late 1720s, 1730s, and then 1740, a major invasion from English Georgia led by Lord Oglethorpe. And he actually beats the British badly. He and the black troops many of whom are fugitive slaves, and they are fighting for their lives and their freedom. Because if the English capture them, they are going to sell them again, and they are not going to enslave them in the Carolinas anymore. They are going to sell them to the sugar plantations that they have in other places, which is basically a death sentence. And so he rises to prominence. His story is fascinating in many other respects, and there's actually a whole book chapter on him, and there's a whole book in which he's the main character by Jane Landers. So they are, what this means so far is that the Spanish largely depend on fugitive slaves for their defense, that military service is an avenue for freedom. He eventually does get a pension, and he lives out his days in Cuba after the English take Florida in 1763, just to return it to the Spanish in 1783 again. Okay, now let's move to Texas. Now we are in Texas. In the 1790s, there's this very interesting case, and by the way, the person doing this research is Maria Esther Hamac. She's an Afro-Mexican, a black Mexican who just got her PhD out of UT Austin. Her dissertation has an embargo. I couldn't get her dissertation, but she has a website. And she has been documented this case, which I had seen in other dissertations, the case of Mary Jean. Mary Jean escapes the South in the 1790s and makes it to San Antonio. In San Antonio, Texas, she finds protection from the government and claims freedom and renames herself Maria Juana. So she's now a Spanish citizen. And she attempts to redeem her enslaved son, who is actually enslaved in Louisiana this time. And for 18 years, she tries until finally the governor raises enough money, helps it. They raise enough money to purchase the freedom of her son 18 years later for 400 silver pesos, 400 silver coins. And this is the beginning of now this story that is involving slaves that are going to be escaping the U.S. and making it into Spanish Texas, and then Mexican Texas, and then Mexico. That third book that I mentioned, Marite's book that just came out very recently, it documents many of the routes that existed, not only through land, even in the early 1800s, people were escaping and making it to Nacogdoches, to Trinidad de Salcedo, to today's Goliad, San Antonio, and then into the Mexican interior. So this is actually an old story, and there are many examples. This example is very interesting. 1803, right after the Louisiana Purchase. The United States is extending now into the Louisiana Territory, which is going to bring the United States right to the borders with Spanish Texas. And with it, it's also slavery. And already this early, we have communities of fugitive slaves that make it to Spanish Texas. We have one community in Nacogdoches, led by Jacques and Julian, which makes it here to the Nacogdoches area. And there's another one also in Trinidad de Salcedo, in today's Madisonville, which is about halfway between Houston and Dallas. It's about halfway in between. Another community. These communities includes dozens of slaves. They find a living working in whatever they can, agriculture, cattle ranching, domestic service. And this is the beginning of a much larger migration that we will see later. So we see how more and more, what we have seen so far is also enslaved people exploiting international rivalries. Enslaved people learn to exploit the international rivalry between the Spanish and the English. Later, they will learn to exploit the international rivalry between Mexico and the US. When Mexico becomes independent in 1821, the same year that it becomes independent, the Anglo-Americans begin to arrive. They get permission from the Mexican government to settle in Texas, but they do not get permission to bring slaves. Actually, the agreement they made is they were going to learn Spanish, become good Catholics, defend the Mexican nation against foreign attacks, and promote the abolition of slavery. They do none of the above. They do none of the above. Actually, they immediately start bringing slaves against Mexican law. And, that is implied in this painting. There's a slave here in the back, right behind Stephen of Austin. And slaves then began fleeing, then outside Texas, outside Mexican Texas, because by this time, many Mexican states are abolishing slavery. By the end of the colonial period, there are about 6,000 slaves in independent Mexico. And Mexico itself has not abolished slavery nationwide, largely because there's a constant, actually a state of civil war that lasts for decades between conservatives and liberals. And conservatives did not really want to abolish slavery, so sometimes if there's a president, a liberal president issues an executive order, slavery is abolished, and he's killed, and there's one that is very soon assassinated. It's followed by someone who reinstates slavery. However, slavery is being abolished in most of the states, and it's frowned upon, but there's still some political rivalry. However, it is actually safer to make it deeper into Mexico, to escape Texas. And people continue escaping Texas during this time period. This case is very interesting, because Francisco Dupois, yes, go ahead.
I've read that American citizens were allowed to immigrate to Mexican Texas with their slaves, but weren't allowed to purchase slaves as Mexican citizens. Is that correct?
That's a good question. We're about to see, because they're going to bring them as indentured servants bound to a 99-year contract, not as slaves. Indentured servants bound to a 99-year contract, not as slaves. So yes, they have legal permission to do that, and it's actually a bill that is slipped. It's one of those bills that the legislature passes without reading. It passed during a very contentious session of the state legislature. Not the national, but the state legislature. Good question. Yes. So this is one of those cases of Francisco Dupois escapes out of New Orleans, and he's one of many that escapes in a cargo ship. And many did this, and it would be, in many cases, with the consent, of the captain, sometimes the whole crew. Just like, we have seen how there were actually crews, there were captains and entire crews that participated in the Underground Railroad that transported slaves from Maryland to northern states. Actually, these things also existed out of New Orleans and later out of Galveston. And so Francisco Dupois is one of those cases. He escapes New Orleans, and he makes it to Veracruz, Mexico. And his name was probably Francis Dubois, because he's in New Orleans, so it has probably a French name. But in Mexico, it gets Spanish. It gets changed to Francisco Dupois, or Dupois, actually, Francisco Dupois. He fled New Orleans. He reached Veracruz, and he served for 20 years in the Mexican infantry. He served in Veracruz, Oaxaca, and Tampico, and he becomes a Mexican hero because he's one of the part of an all-black company that defends Tampico against a U.S. attack during the U.S. occupation of Mexico, the U.S. invasion of Mexico in 1847. So he becomes a hero. That's Francisco Dupois. And this, by the way, there are more people doing this research. This example comes from an article by Sarah Cornell, who's at the University of Massachusetts, who wrote a dissertation also. But so far she's revising that and will soon be a book. So there's more and more research coming out as we speak. When it came to extradition, the Mexican Americans claimed the moral ground. They claimed that the Americans were corrupt because Americans were slave owners. The Americans, in turn, claimed that Mexicans were inferior because they did not acknowledge the supposed natural condition of Africans, which, according to Americans, slavery was something natural. That was the condition that they were supposed to be in. So there's this, part of this is an ideological battle. And starting in 1826, the Americans constantly demand an extradition treaty for the Mexicans to sign extradition treaties with the Americans, and the Mexicans refuse constantly. And this goes on actually for decades. At one point, even, several points, the Americans try to slip the fine print. Something like, okay, well, Mexican criminals to come to the U.S., we'll capture them, turn them over to you, and then you Mexicans, you capture American criminals that go into your land. And then in the fine print, and by the way, fugitive slaves are criminals too. But the Mexicans never fall for it, so the Mexicans never sign these extraditing treaties, which infuriates the Americans. And that is one of the causes for the Texas Revolution and for the war with Mexico, and later for a new attempt to conquer Mexico in the 1850s. At least the rhetoric is there. It's a demand that Sam Houston makes in 1858. When it comes to Texas, actually the San Antonio elite, many of them are actually on the side of the Americans. That's going to answer your question, because it is actually the San Antonio elite that slips this bill. The elites were the Navarros and the Seguins, and the Blancos were part of the Arciniegas. All of these were part of the elites. The Navarro patriarch, he was a cattle rancher and a slave trader. He sold Native American slaves in New Orleans. Yes, most people enslaved were Africans, but Native Americans were enslaved, and Mexicans were enslaved too. The book by Torget documents that Mexicans were captured at the Battle of San Jacinto and sold into slavery throughout the American South. However, many of them, especially if they had families, their descendants are part of the African American community. In answering your question, it was on May 25th, 1828, that two Tejanos, two Mexican Americans from Texas, Jose Antonio Navarro, the son of Ángel Navarro, and Jose Miguel de Arciniega, they slipped this bill in the Coahuilas, Texas legislature, allowing Americans to bring Africans signed to a 99-year indenture contract into Mexican Texas. 99-year. The San Antonio elites were buying into this. They were thinking that they would become Southern gentlemen like Andrew Jackson. So they played, Victor Blanco, former governor of Coahuila, Texas, he bought African slaves. Erasmo Seguin, the patriarch of the Seguin family, the father of Juan Seguin, he experimented with cotton plantations. And so the San Antonio elite, the Mexican American elites, the Tejano elites, are thinking that they will become, after the Texas Revolution, actually many of them are going to flee for their lives. Some of them are going to be murdered. One of Ángel Navarro's sons, the brother of Jose Antonio, the guy that introduced this bill for 99-year contracts for indentured servants, was murdered in 1842 in San Antonio. The son of Erasmo Seguin, Juan Seguin, he fled for his life after being the mayor of San Antonio. So the Mexican-American elites are not going to fare well after independence. In 1829, Vicente Guerrero, a black man, became president of Mexico. He was one of the heroes of independence. And he signed an executive order abolishing slavery, but he was very soon overthrown and executed. He was a liberal by the his conservative rivals. And when he was executed, people kind of forgot about his executive order, but by now most of the states had abolished slavery. And Santa Anna, at one point, he's making reference to that contract. Now, this is not so much about the Texas Revolution because it is contentious. However, scholars do agree today, and I can give you a long bibliography. The main cause of the Texas Revolution was Mexican abolitionism. It was slavery. It was keeping slavery. Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna is quoted as having said this as he marched his troops from Mexico into Texas. There is a considerable number of slaves in Texas also who have been introduced by their masters under cover of certain questionable contracts. 99-year contracts, under cover of, but who according to our law should be free. Shall we permit these wretches to moan in chains any longer in a country whose kind laws protect the liberty of men without distinction of caste of color? That's him. And of course, Lopez de Santa Anna is deeply flawed, but he's not the devil of Texas history. He's not the devil that Texas history makes him out to be. I mean, just this morning, it was in my classes that we were talking about the myths about Santa Anna, that he was sleeping with a woman at the time of the Battle of San Jacinto, that he was high on opium, that he was, well, the truth is, yeah, he was taking an opium nap. Now opium is the main painkiller and they did take opium. Sam Houston took a lot of opium too, and Santana too. That's what people did when they were in pain. Also when they could not sleep. I mean, in the 1880s, people gave cocaine drops to their kids when they had a toothache. The Pope in the 1890s carried a flask of a tonic that was sugar, alcohol, and cocaine. So when you feel bad, you take a small sip and you feel you're okay. Okay, but the main cause, okay, of the Battle of San Jacinto, there's archaeological evidence now even, was simply the technology. The Americans had rifles that could kill at 400 yards. The Mexicans had muskets. You had to get within 40 yards to hit somebody. And they were highly inaccurate. So there's a difference in technology that is tremendous. Go ahead.
I was going to ask you, did Santana's army have enslaved Africans and as part of his?
No, actually, he's an abolitionist. He was an abolitionist. He came to abolish slavery. However, that's actually good because he's from Veracruz. He was born in Veracruz, which has one of the largest black populations in Mexico. And he actually grew in African communities. So that's why he's an abolitionist, because he considers Africans his equals. So he's actually an abolitionist. Now, he's deeply flawed. Now, he overthrew a constitution. He overthrew the government. He did a lot of things. I mean, he is, in today's world, we would call him a populist. However, he is also an abolitionist. And in Texas history, well, that's the thing about Texas history, that most of what we think we know is myth. And professional historians, some of what I'm telling you, professional historians have known since the 1910s. I have articles from the 1910s that make these arguments, like that slavery was the main cause of the Texas Revolution is fully documented by 1987. 1987 by Paul Lack, an article and then followed by a book. But somehow popular historians in some cases have nothing to do with academic historians, have nothing to do with research. They just reproduce the myths. So he came to abolish slavery, and he lost, the Mexicans lost, but now the Constitution of Texas tells us what the Texas Revolution was really about. All persons of color who were slaves for life shall remain in the like state of servitude. This is 1836 Texas Revolution. Congress shall pass no laws to prohibit immigrants from bringing slaves into the Republic. No free person of African descent shall be permitted to reside permanently in the Republic. We just had a speaker, Sam Haynes. He has a whole book. One of the main characters is a rich Texas black man, very rich, very powerful under Mexican law in the Mexican period. As soon as you have Texas independence, he's deprived of his citizenship, but he has friends in high places who allow him to stay in Texas. But he loses all political influence, and gradually he loses his fortune too. Gradually he loses his fortune because he is completely disempowered politically. And he does not die in poverty, but he doesn't die the equivalent of the millionaire that he was. Go ahead.
Yes, so how young were some of the names on the indenture, on the documents that said that these people gave their life for 99 plus years?
So some of these people bound to a 99-year contract were as young as 3 years old, supposedly voluntarily signing away their lives. I'll be your servant for 99 years. Yes. So no. I mean, they had permission from the Mexican government. That's right. Yes. And again, once again, this was a bill that they slipped not in the national legislature, in the Coahuila legislature, in a very contentious session where it was slipped at the very end where nobody read it. And okay, continuing. So were there networks of people that helped fugitive slaves? Well, yes, there were Mexican friends and family members. There were, be right with you. Like, for example, marriages. There were quite a few people who married, they had been married sometimes for 10 years when they escaped. Go ahead.
What happened to the children of those indentured servants before the new Constitution designated them as slaves?
Oh, they were enslaved for life. They were all enslaved for life. I mean, that was just, there was never an intention of the part of the Anglos to say, you are not a slave. I mean, it was a subterfuge. It was a way of getting around Mexican law. But it was very clear. If you look at the Constitution of 1836, they had the intention to bring a lot more slaves. The U.S. international slave trade had been banned. They could no longer bring slaves from overseas. However, Texas was a republic until 1845. So they brought lots of slaves from Africa, from Cuba, from Brazil. So they have family members, okay, some of them, friends, family members. German Americans helped a lot. German Americans, Native Americans also. Native Americans assisted. And then you have professional smugglers, people that actually charged. And so some slaves stayed for years and paid somebody. And then you also had actually Mexican hacendados actually commissioning these professional smugglers. Bring me some of those African-American workers from Texas because they work very hard and they don't complain about what they get paid. In other words, yes, exploited for cheap labor in Mexico, yes, that too. That was part of the experience, which also happened a lot in Canada, by the way. Many African Americans who fled to Canada were exploited for cheap labor. So the networks are very complex. It includes professional smugglers. There were also people in Mexico that assisted Americans when they went to capture slaves. I mean, we had cases. There's a case in 1849 in Guerrero, Coahuila, where a woman that was living there, had been living there for free. The master shows up and tries to kidnap her in the middle of the night, assisted by another American. And the town, they hear the cry, they chase these two men out of the town, and then on the road, the assistant escapes. But the former owner gets killed, gets shot. They drag the corpse back to Guerrero, Coahuila, and they put him on trial, and they give him a defense attorney. And they find him guilty of attempted kidnapping, and then they bury him. There was another case, I mean, one among many cases, 1855. One of many cases, 1855. Yes, the Callahan expedition. His name is James Hugh Callahan, Texas Ranger. He leads 111 men into Piedras Negras. And the attempt, actually, they were trying to capture black Seminoles who are now living in Mexico free. And the people of Piedras Negras actually organized, and they defend the town. So there's a battle for Piedras Negras, and then as the Americans retreat, the Texas Rangers retreat, they set the town on fire. They torch as many buildings as they can. So the Texas Rangers were sometimes companies as large as 111 men going into Mexico to capture fugitive slaves. So what the government of Mexico did is they try to get them as deep into the interior as possible. Try not to let fugitive slaves stay in those border towns because they could easily be captured. Take them deep into Tampico, Monterrey, Mexico, Ciudad Victoria, or away from the border towns. In 1837, right after the Texas Revolution, the Mexicans now abolished slavery constitutionally. A new constitution in 1857 actually acknowledged refugee slaves as Mexican citizens who are protected by Mexican law. In this period in between, these 20 years, there's an argument as to the fate, the condition of these slave refugees. Some argue that, hey, they are not really protected by Mexican law. It's like you can stay, but you're not a citizen. But others like Baumgartner, who wrote that big book, and she spoke at Lone Star a couple of years ago online. She would say that at this time, that concept of citizenship is not dominant. I mean, in my case, my wife, she did not get a birth certificate until she was 9, so she did not even legally exist. So actually, citizenship was more like belonging and belonging in the community. And if the community is organizing and putting their lives on the line, and some giving their lives, dying from bullets from the Texas Rangers to defend fugitive slaves, if they are killing a slave owner and putting the corpse on trial, then you are a member of the community, then you are a citizen. The concept of citizenship as we know it is not the concept of this time. So Baumgartner would say, yes, they are citizens. But in 1857, this becomes now de facto. You are citizens now. They continue to escape, many, not only through land, but also you see out of Galveston, Brazoria, make it into colonies in Matamoros, Tampico, Veracruz, Minatitlan, all along the Gulf of Mexico. So many come into all these colonies, and you have colonies throughout Mexico. We don't know the number of people. Newspapers in the 19th century, they were saying that 100,000 people had escaped to Mexico. Today's scholars say, no, that's too many. Some scholars say it was 4,000. Most say, no, that's not. So scholars seem to be settling on a number around 10,000. But for everyone that made it, there were many, many, many that didn't make it, that were caught, which means that there were very likely perhaps 100,000 who attempted. It's like the Underground Railroad to Canada. Many argue that it was about 100,000 people who escaped to Canada. That means that over 1 million tried. So you have all these colonies, and it's thousands of people along Mexico, so it's not just border towns. And again, these are ports of entry. In most cases, people went deeper into Mexico because it was not safe to stay here. The Texas Rangers were coming to get you. There's an example I mentioned earlier. Maria Esther Hamag, that historian I was talking about, is doing research into this case. And what she's found so far, and she has just a few web articles, like I said, her dissertation has an embargo because the book is about to be published. And she did some research in this case. This is about a Mexican man and his African-American enslaved wife who had been living together for about 10 years. After 10 years, they make a break for it. They steal 2 horses, and they get hunted down. They get captured. Okay, they get captured. All this happens in this area around Austin. When they are captured, they immediately, the vigilantes, the slave patrols, immediately lynch the man. And they return the wife to slavery. And this is one of many cases. I found this is online. The University of North Texas has many documents like this, and I have gotten lots of this, and sometimes these are assignments, like for document analysis for a classroom. Very good assignments, by the way. People seem to really enjoy these types of assignments. With the breakout of the Mexican War, the war against Mexico, which will take a lot more territory from Mexico, come the question, what is going to happen with slavery? Slavery had been banned in Mexican territory. Are we going to introduce slavery where it didn't exist in the past? And Americans in Congress, in the Senate, decide no. Southerners want to expand it. David Wilmot, a Northern Democrat, he writes this document known as the Wilmot Proviso, which does prevail. And Congress argues that no, you cannot extend slavery to those new territories. This is going to be one of the main causes of the Civil War, the fact that the nation doesn't seem to be willing to allow slavery to extend. And of course, there will be debates, and even the Supreme Court is going to at one point argue that you cannot no longer ban, it was in the Dred Scott case in the 1850s, that you cannot ban slavery anywhere, but by that time the nation is about to fight a civil war. So the conquest of Mexico had a major impact on slavery and on the coming of the Civil War. With that came more and more slaves fleeing into Mexico, including those two of the video clip. And this is a book, actually it's from the 1950s, 1954, Sam Houston, the great designer, by Lorena Friend. One of the statements there on pages 101 and 183 is that in 1841, quoting, 2 Negro boys for whom I had recently paid $2,100 had run to Mexico. One of them has been, for some years, an officer in the Mexican army, and the other a barber in Matamoros. Okay. And many argue that this just humiliated Sam Houston so much that this is one of the reasons why in 1858 he made an argument for a new invasion of Mexico and declaring and making Mexico a protectorate. His arguments were, we're about to fight a civil war, let's fight a foreign enemy instead. Let's get united and attack Mexico because, hey, Mexico is just a nest of bandits. All those criminals that hide in Mexico that are constantly attacking the US, that was his argument. And historians argue, no, he could not stand the fact that Texas slaves, people enslaved in Texas, they were the largest number of those who escaped to Mexico. Yeah, some fled New Orleans, some fled Arkansas, some fled the American South, but most fled Texas. Black Seminoles, the whole tribe relocated to Mexico. In 1838, the tribe signed a treaty with the US government, relocated to a reservation, just to be betrayed 10 years later, in 1848, by the US Attorney General, who declared that they were actually fugitive slaves, meaning you can hunt them down, capture them, and sell them. And so the whole tribe migrated. It's really an odyssey. There's a couple of books. Kenneth Parker wrote, I think, well, anyway, there are a couple of excellent books about this. One of them, my students have read it in the past. The whole tribe migrated to Mexico. Black Seminoles and part of the Seminole tribe, the Native American Seminole tribe, and they settled in this region away from the border. This is the border, in an oasis in the Sabine River. Now, climate change has made this a desert again, so many of them also came back to the US after 1860. But this also became one of those communities that attracted so many fugitive slaves. This was one of those communities that attracted so many fugitive slaves. It was the community of the Black Seminoles. This case is very interesting. The Gordon brothers in early 1852, starting with Albert. He escaped slavery. He was captured in San Antonio. He escaped again. He joined the Black Seminoles. He was already in freedom. He had to come back and rescue his two brothers. So he came back and he rescued his brothers Isaac and Henry, and he was captured again and escaped again. And the three of them eventually joined the Black Seminoles in Mexico. This is almost like a Mexican Harry Tubman story. And it's stories like this that researchers are trying to see if they can find more information to make into biographies or monographs centered on specific cases. Please, Anthony.
What type of documentation are you finding to recreate these stories? Are they diaries? Are these newspaper clippings?
Many of them are books and articles. So most of them are secondary sources. This is something that I started in graduate school. I took a whole course, and I regret not having done that into a dissertation. So I did, it actually started with digitized newspapers. And there are lots of digitized newspapers. But then something I found is that those documents, I found them, but I was not the first to find them. I'm finding them that some people found these documents in the 60s, in the 70s. But nobody had written a big book about this. Now people are writing the big books. Marite has this book that was just released, Creative Commons PDF available. Baumgartner gave a talk for us. Hamak just wrote a big dissertation. There are lots of dissertations now. So now we are finding more and more and more. Personally, like digging through databases, sometimes you find one newspaper clip, but then some people are digging deeper, like Hamak, and they're trying to find, like family histories or biographies, which so far, this is an emerging field. This is not like the Underground Railroad to Canada, which has been, actually, we have books about that were written in the 1860s. This is an emerging field, and much of the research is only a couple of years old. It's fascinating, though. It's really, really fascinating. This is the last example. Jack Thompson. This guy is just fascinating. He escaped. He was named after his master. He escapes with money, guns, munition, a map, and a compass, and a watch. But he's not fully fluent in Spanish, so he makes himself a crude wig that doesn't really fool anybody. The wig is pretty crude. Straight hair, straight black hair. The wig is very, very crude. He tries to pass for Mexican. He calls himself Don Cuchillo Negro. So he is not a native speaker. You don't call yourself that. Negro can be a last name, but that's kind of, not only that, that's probably going to give you away. Okay? And so he was not a native speaker, but he tried to make it. Don Cuchillo Negro, and he was captured by gold prospectors near the Pecos River. So he was trying to make it like to the area near El Paso. And he was returned to his master in Cora in today's Comanche County, which is about between Fort Worth and Abilene, and he escapes again. And it's stories like this that we wish that we could keep tracking them and finding them. Like Joe Travis, the slave of William Travis, exactly 1 year after the Alamo, he and a friend escaped to Mexico. But we all thought that he had lived out his life in Mexico. No, somebody dug deeper, and they found that he actually just went to Mexico and then returned to the U.S., and then he went back to find his family and lived in freedom in the U.S. as a fugitive slave. He lived as a fugitive slave. And that's actually what happens with most of these cases. Most of these people, not only the ones who fled to Mexico, most of the ones who fled to Canada came back to the U.S. after emancipation, after the Civil War. Family networks. Life in Mexico was very hard. Even back then, income was very low. So actually, the U.S. actually offered a higher income. And of course, family networks. And I mean, you want to be near family, right? And most of the ones that fled to Canada came back to the U.S. There are a few exceptions. Josiah Henson. Josiah Henson is now a hero of Canadian history. They have post stamps. He stayed in Canada. But most of those who went to Mexico came back to the U.S. And this was this concludes the presentation. So basically, it concludes like this. Starting in the 17th century, African Americans enslaved in the English North American colonies, they found opportunities for a less oppressive existence in Spanish Florida, where the Spanish established alliances with indigenous people from the region and with slave refugees against their common rival, the English Empire. This pattern then continued in Spanish Texas and then in Mexico. So this talk tried to explore how, after the Mexicans abolished slavery in the early 19th century, thousands of slave refugees fled the U.S., found freedom in Mexico, and became part of the fabric of Mexican society. My wife is from Ciudad Victoria, and that was a destination for African slaves. I had a student this morning that was from one of those towns in Coahuila where Black Seminoles went, which became a major magnet for, this was one of the biggest webs, or one of the biggest parts of the network. The Black Seminoles, they welcomed hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of African Americans who joined them. And so once you have these networks, sometimes these are family networks. Like, the case of Albert Gordon, he returns for his brothers. And you have communities spread throughout Mexico. This morning I had a student from one of these communities, and I'm not sure if he was Musquiz or Nacimiento, It was one of these. And she said, I was born in that community. But, you know, there are not very many black people there today. I said, well, they've been mixing for 100 years. And 1, 2, many came back to the US. 3, many have spread out throughout Mexico because that region has been swallowed by the desert. And so it's hard to make a living. Most people made a living out of agriculture. I'm also from one of those communities. It was an oasis when I was a kid. It's completely desert now. I mean, the deserts are expanding. The Sonora Desert, around Lake Chad in Africa, you know, the deserts have swallowed. Climate change is very, very real. So most of them came back to the U.S., and that's, but this still, you know, again, this is still a very, I mean, to me, it's incredibly fascinating. I taught this course for 3 semesters, and when I was like, oh man, you know, I kept cutting slides. This is too long just to add them again. No, it's too long, but it's too important to leave out. It's too long, but then it's, so even just before that, I was putting some of that stuff back. Yeah, okay, so this is it. Questions? Questions, anybody? Please. Yeah, please, Anthony.
Are Mexican scholars doing this research, or is it primarily just here in the U.S. Southwest that they're rediscovering and retelling these stories?
I found two dissertations by Mexicans. I started to read them. Everybody seems to be repeating the same information. Like new dissertations, they seem to be very repetitive, the same examples, and actually that's part of the problem. So far, the evidence we have is not very much. There's not a whole lot of evidence. And the first place people go to is where I went when I took that graduate class, online databases. Then after that, then you start going, Baumgartner did that, go to that example of the slave owner who was killed and then brought to trial. He found that a local archive. A small town, now the problem with Mexico also right now, especially the north, it's dominated by the drug cartel, so it's very dangerous. And sometimes it can be more dangerous if you're an outsider and you are, you know, or even if it's not, I don't feel safe, so I don't encourage my friends, say, you know, go do research in those places. And so that's another problem. The National Archives don't have a whole lot of information. Much of that is scattered in small places. And also, some of that information, many of the archives are not classified. They have rooms with the boxes of dusty papers that have not even been classified. So it's a matter, I think people are going to flesh this out. To answer your question again, I have seen 2 dissertations from Mexico, and I started to look at them and like, man, you know, this is pretty repetitive. So far, the best I found is the one that Maria Esther Hamac, well, I read her master's thesis. The master's thesis was already excellent. She's from Mexico, but she's educated in the US. Master's in Georgia, PhD in the dissertation right now has an embargo, but it will be released. The book will be released very soon. So yeah, it's mostly actually, most of the research is being done in the US to make, yeah. Somebody else?
Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you for coming.
Thanks for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe for more content from LSC-Kingwood.